Greetings, greetings. You are now tuned into the Vault. Trust Christian, own nothing, control everything. Just want to thank you for tuning in live or listening in the replay. Definitely excited about doing this episode. This episode is going to be about what is an asset protection trust. Most likely we'll end up going to the IRS website to kind of maybe even put in an asset protection trust. And the reason why I do what I do as far as the going to the IRS website sometime is because really, I mean, if you're going to be reporting and doing accounting for these entities, you obviously need to know who you're going to be dealing with. So, I like going directly to the source. A lot of people are scared of the IRS, and I'm a big fan of people just understanding uh, that the IRS is an accounting agency. So, just going to pull up that asset protection trust. So when you go to IRS website, you see uh, abusive trust, tax evasion schemes. The reason why I wanted to do this episode about asset protection trust, why and how, is because I just want to share with you all. Trust Christian has a specific education, a private education from private mentors. It wasn't something that I learned in school. It was something that I learned from mentors, wealthy individuals, trustees. Um, some of them are still alive. Some of them I still stay in contact with. But it was a private community of trustees that I learned in, and we worked together and mastermind and disseminated information because they felt that our respective families needed to know how to operate in trust, not just wealthy families. And the reason why we knew that we had to disseminate that information was because there are security exchange commission laws that are in place to say if you don't make a certain amount of money that you shouldn't be privy to certain financial information. And a trust is nothing more than a contract, and that's something that we always made it a point to make very clear to each other. So when you think about it, you're already contracting on a daily basis. And so it was just important for us to understand something as elementary, I should say, and basic as understanding that a trust is a contract. And we always went over the power of contracts because that's what's regulating people's lives. That's what's regulating the reality of the situation. Thanks, D, for tuning in live. And so what we really want to understand is that an asset protection trust is nothing more than just a contract holding assets. Now, I am going to do my best to give as much information as I possibly can on this episode. So once again, what is an asset protection trust? It's a contract. Now, we deal in private contracts. We deal in public contracts. Public contracts are legislative trust. They're public trust. There's two different types of trust on the onset, which are public trusts, which are regulated by statute and legislation. That means the government came up with the rules for these type of trusts. Whereas at the vault, that's why it's called the vault. It's a private community, a private trustees. So we go over what private contracts are, and private contracts don't involve the government. So I had a question. Someone contacted us at the vault. They said, well, if I have a trust, will I need to register it with the state or the county? If you register it, that means it's turned into a form of a public entity. We don't register our private entities. That means you're giving away privacy. So we focus on maintaining privacy at the vault. So no, we wouldn't register any type of entity with any type of public governmental organization, no matter even if it's an agency of the government. So even when, and this is something that I really want to make clear, especially with the asset protection trust, I might have some people say, well, does it have to get an EIN number, which is an employer identification number? Sometimes the asset protection trust might just hold hard assets, collectible art, cars, diamonds, pearls, rubies, silver, gold, hard, tangible assets, not anything intangible. Intangible would be currency. See, a lot of people think money is just the paper dollar bills, but it's actually the digital aspect. So it's digital money and there's paper money. And so it's still considered an asset, but it's in a digital form, which is more of an intangible. It's not as tangible as the quote unquote dollar bills, or what we would recommend and what we talk about at the vault, which is having a harder, tangible, and even non-confiscatable gold and silver American Eagle coins. So when we talk about asset protection, we're talking about asset protection trust from the perspective of a contract holding hard assets. See, people say, well, what's the difference between giving legal advice and yada, yada, yada? We want to make sure that as entrepreneurs or as a family, you are protecting your assets. Even if you, and what we do in trust is we give up ownership of them. We give up, but we don't give up control. That's why it's trust Christian, own nothing, control everything. It's because we're not giving up control of assets. We're just giving up ownership, which you're supposed to do in the first place. You don't need to own anything. Anything you own can be taxed or you can be sued for. So an asset protection trust is the first line of defense. Who needs an asset protection trust? Because a lot of people ask me, when I first started doing trustee training, asset protection, my mentors, I wouldn't say my mentors, but I would say outside individuals that weren't involved in our particular private community, they would say, well, if a person's not making a certain amount of money, you shouldn't even be talking to them about this information. If a person's not even holding a certain number of assets, you shouldn't even be talking to them about this information. Once again, the private community that I come from with my trust mentors, we always keep it as elementary as a contract. And everybody's going to deal with contracts. So the first thing is knowing how to put your wealth in the correct tax position. But the second thing we learned was how to protect that wealth. Okay, so it's not about how much money you make. It's about how much you're allowed to keep. You think about it as, thanks Trey Stone for turning live. If you think about it, if an individual such as Bill Gates, such as Google, such as Mark Zuckerberg, if they're not paying taxes, do you think it's going to be hard for them to amass wealth? Do you think it's going to be hard for them to pass on their wealth when they have tax-exempt entities? But the average individual isn't educated on this information. Why? Because there is an income type requirement. But when we broke it down into a contract and an educational platform, it was something that we can discuss because contracts are something you're going to deal in every single day. So when it comes to asset protection, what's the point of even going out and acquiring assets? Dollar bills, gold, silver, cars, houses, art, diamonds, gold, silver. What is the point of going out and acquiring those things if you don't have the proper entity to hold them? See, people say, well, who really needs these entities? Anybody that's acquiring an asset. You just don't want to acquire the asset in your name. Why? Because that's a public education. A private education says, own nothing, control everything. You don't need to own it. You just need to control it. Just like you're controlling everything that you have in your life right now. That's it. So an asset protection trust is not even on the IRS website because IRS does not recognize what's considered an asset protection trust, because a true asset protection trust is a private trust. That's what most people don't understand. It's a private contract between private parties protecting private assets. So when you think that you might need to report these private assets, you don't need to report those private assets. There's a difference between an asset and income. That's what we educate and make sure that you know in private trustee training. Is there's a difference, once again, between assets and income. Income is something that you generate from a trade, doing business thereof. An asset is something that you acquire. Something that has no encumbrances. Something that doesn't incur a tax. Some people say, well, what about capital gains tax? Remember, if you hold a property and it increases in value, when do you get taxed on it? It either gets taxed on a sale or a capital gain or a dividend distribution. The IRS is really clear about that. When entities, quote unquote entity, a trust as an entity, it's a contract, when it's tax liable. So, when do you need an asset protection trust? When you're acquiring assets. To get past the first step, which is the tax position, but to protect it, you have to do things at arm's length distance. Why do you think Zuckerberg, why do you think Warren Buffett, why do you think Bill Gates all have charities? It's to do things in a tax-free arm's length distance manner. They can't be sued. The trust can't be sued. Those charities, the charity is for the benefit of the public. But the charity still owns a private jet. The charity still owns clothing. The charity still owns shoes that they're wearing on their feet. They have a fringe benefits package built into the contract. They don't even own the clothes on their back. That's what you learn in private trustee training. Oh, well, what about the businesses that I currently have? Grant them over to the trust. Give the assets away, but maintain control. It's an asset. Asset protection. Let me share with you all what we know in private trustee training. The greatest asset before you acquire hard, tangible assets is you. You want to know one of the oldest, longest standing assets? I did an episode on Facebook. It's a 500-year-old asset that the average individual is not even educated on because they have a public education. So here it is. In an asset protection trust, you as the trustee, the trust is supposed to have an insurance policy on you. The insurance policy is insurance on one of the greatest assets. So if something happens to that asset, it can actually replenish itself. The trust can replenish itself for the next generation, whether it's your children or the next trustee, so it can carry on a legacy because the trust doesn't die. You may have, but the trust is holding that insurance policy on its greatest asset. It has that's an expense for the trust while it's doing it. It's an expense. It's a business expense on the trustee. And then on the back end of that, if the trustee actually does go before the policy is meant to pay out, then guess what? When it does happen, when the trustee passes on, the trust replenishes funds or gains funds from no tax consequence to the trust from the insurance policy. This is what you learn in private trustee training. This is how you pass on wealth from one generation to the next tax-free. Asset protection. It's just that simple. So I just want to thank you all for tuning in live, listening to the replay. That's what an asset protection trust is. It's something that protects its greatest asset. The trustee. You. And then it can protect other additional assets. See, a lot of wealthy people say, why teach common people this information? They're not thinking about wealth. They're thinking about money. They're not thinking about wealth. They're thinking about getting rich. They're thinking about the football game. They're thinking about the basketball game. They don't really want to pass on wealth. They have a public education. We made sure they had a public education. I'm here to tell you all, trust Christian. Own nothing, control everything. That's the lifestyle that's meant to be lived. Because in all actuality, we don't own anything. We just control it. But because of a public education, people have been taught to own a house, to own a car, to own everything. But guess what? There was no caveat to tell them, even if you own a business, you can be sued for the business. That's why you're supposed to trust Christian, own nothing, control everything. That's why. Thank you all for tuning in live, listening to the replay. Feel free to share this with your friends and family. All the individuals that are public thinking that, hey, I need to have everything in my name. What an interesting education that is. What happened to the greatest asset protection? What is an asset protection trust education? What happened to that? So thank you all for tuning in. Feel free to ask any questions. I'll stay on for another minute, or I will. Here we go. We have a question. This is why the public needs to be educated on when there are people operating in private trust. They do not disclose private to the public. The public tries to come after them and take and make them prove assets. Oh, very much so. Great point, Sandra Boyd. And it's really interesting that, you know, because the public is so uneducated, there's a misconception that privacy is not upheld. See, that's what they want you to believe. See, wealthy people wrote the constitutional laws. Wealthy people write the tax laws. Let's not be fooled here, people. Poor people don't have any say-so in anything. That's the facts. Harsh reality or not, that's the facts. So the fact is that there is no law that will impair the obligation of a contract. And a contract is private. If it's private. Now, if it starts to be disclosed to the public, then it's public. There's a difference between clear separation of public and private. That's why when you see governmental people say, well, you know, the private sector is doing really well. Why? Because they can't speak on the private sector. They have no jurisdiction in the private sector. But most people would say, well, how do I know I'm really going to have my assets protected inside of a private contract? Here you go. This is the first law you learn in private trustee training. Article 1, Section 10, that was written by rich people, wealthy people. No state, it's in part, it's actually a decent sized article, but in part, it says no state will impair the obligation of contracts. You have the quote unquote right to privately contract unlimited, and it is protected in the Constitution. The only state that doesn't have that common law aspect to it is Louisiana. This is the education you get in private trustee training. Louisiana is considered a Napoleonic civil law jurisdiction, but guess what? It still falls under the United States, just like Puerto Rico, just like Hawaii. So it falls up under the United States, and they adhere to the United States, the federal level. Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution. So privacy is protected. But, talking to your public educated friends, they might tell you, oh, it's not, and it's being abridged. And it's like, well, what part of the Constitution is not valid for rich people? But for some odd reason, somebody that's not even making $10 million a year, that usually wouldn't even be privy to this information, has an opinion. Very interesting. So, thanks for the statement and questions, Andrea. I appreciate you. Definitely going to go ahead and hop off. And thank you all so much for tuning in live or listening to the replay. If you want to get in contact with Trust Christian, feel free to email us at christian@trustchristian.com. It's christian@trustchristian.com. And we'll definitely make sure that, if we want to take care of a consultation or anything of that nature, feel free to contact us. Xandra Boy said, this is why it's best to have a private trust as opposed to just discharging that as people are trying to do. Oh, yeah, I mean, honestly, Xandra, it's really interesting because there's a difference between public and private. Public is going to be dealing with a discharge, whereas in the private, it's purely based off of credit. There's no debt in private. Debt, and even if it is some type of contract that's going to validate the good faith and credit of the contract in the beginning and things of that nature. So, it is best for people to go private and put their assets in an asset protection trust. But the average individual, they're so consumed with public rhetoric and information that you have to really declutter your mind from a public education, or you just have to say, I'm going to focus on being private and put your energy into something that's more productive in acquiring wealth, because all wealth is private. If you guys don't think that the Rockefellers are richer than Jeff Bezos, who's on the Forbes 100 list, or the Waltons, if you don't think the Rockefellers are richer than the Waltons, it's really interesting that you would think such a thing. I can share with you all how the Rockefellers are controlling the education system in most colleges they set up. So their wealth is just private. Even the Rothschilds' wealth is private. So it's not in the public. So when you see a lot of these names on the Forbes 100 list, they haven't really came into the full understanding or knowledge, or they're not fully practicing privacy. And that's very understandable and respectable. And when you see Forbes mention their wealth, they mention their wealth in an asset entity-based mentality. It's not, oh, this person directly owns these assets. They'll say this person's worth based on their company or based off of this. Well, okay, just because a person founded it doesn't mean they own it. They may have given up ownership to a private entity, and yes, they still founded it, but they don't own it. So it's really important about who owns and who controls. So thank you all for tuning in live, listening to replay. Feel free to contact us. Trust Christian. Own nothing, control everything. Peace and blessings. Enjoy your holidays coming in on a new year 2017, going into 18. Be prepared to make your year the best year of your life. Thank you, and peace and blessings.